I want to talk about the protests taking place in Georgia. This is a nation in the Caucasus region. It borders Russia to the south. And I just want to start by reading some of the articles about this from the Western media just in the last 24 hours. So this is from the BBC. Georgia protests. Police push protesters back from parliament. And the article says police have used water cannon and tear gas against protesters in Georgia's capital, Tbilisi, for a second night. The crowds are angry at a controversial Russian-style law, which would class non-government and media groups as foreign agents if they receive more than 20% of their funds from abroad. But this is not a Russian-style law. This is a law that almost every country on earth either has or is attempting to pass, and in the West, most certainly they have laws like this on the books already. The United States has the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA. They've had this for decades, and it's actually much stricter than the law that Georgia was trying to pass, which, by the way, they have failed to pass. I'll get into that in just a moment. The BBC also says a similar law in Russia has been used to severely limit press freedom and suppress civil society. We think that our government is under Russian influence, and it's very bad for our future, said Lizzie, one of the many students taking part in the protests. I just think that it's ironic that they believe that their country is under Russian influence when these protests themselves are a byproduct of U.S. influence and, I would say, interference in Georgia's internal political affairs. And if this looks very similar to what happened in Ukraine in 2014, that's because it is exactly the same process. And I will get into that also in just a moment. The article also says the protesters worry that the new law, if passed, would damage the country's hopes of joining the EU. At this point, who pursuing their own best interest and their nation's best interest would be trying to get into the European Union at this point. The entire European Union is going over the cliff. Why would you want to hitch your wagon onto that and follow over the edge with them? It talks about a student protester, and it says she and her friends were there to fight for Western values and freedom, and that the protesters would not allow the government to stop Georgia's push to join the EU. We're going to fight them, and we will not stop until we win. Think about what they're actually protesting against. They claim they're fighting for Western values, but what are they actually protesting against? They're protesting against a bill that is going to force foreign-funded organizations to disclose their foreign funding so that everyone understands where they're getting their money from, and to register as foreign agents because they are serving as vectors for foreign interests. What is this called? This is called transparency. So they claim they're fighting for Western values while actually openly fighting against transparency. And the reason why the West has opposition groups out in the streets fighting against this bill is because this bill is going to limit U.S. interference inside Georgia's internal political affairs. And a bill like this should not even be necessary because under the UN Charter, foreign interference is already against international law. But the U.S. does it anyway. The UN will do nothing about it. Nations have to pass laws like this to protect themselves. Then the BBC says Georgia Dream chairman said criticism of the draft law as similar to Russia's own repressive legislation was misleading. And it's the BBC putting in repressive legislation in relation to Russia's own laws. It says, in the end, the stir will die out and the public will have transparency in the funding of NGOs, he said. And hopefully, even though the bill has been withdrawn, for now, hopefully this will pass, because I don't think anyone could argue, honestly, that NGOs, media organizations, should be able to hide their foreign funding, especially when it's coming from the United States, Europe, and the UK, European Union and the UK. Then the BBC says, however, Transparency International told the BBC that NGOs were already subject to 10 different laws and the finance ministry already had full access to accounts, funding, and other information. So this is an organization called Transparency International who's claiming that Georgia already has laws about this. We don't need any more laws. So this is an organization literally called Transparency International arguing against additional transparency. But when you look at who supports Transparency International, it becomes very clear what this actually all is. So we go to Transparency International's official website, who supports us, how we're funded. We come down, you see most of their funding comes from governments. I wonder which governments are funding them. Well, how about the US State Department or the UK Foreign Office? How about the European Commission? And then if we come down, we see Open Society. We also see International Republican Institute, which is a subsidiary of the US government's National Endowment for Democracy, which is the organization putting all of these opposition groups out into the streets in the first place. So they're claiming that this is somehow repressive against freedom and democracy and human rights. Actually, the bill is legitimately going after foreign interference, and these opposition groups, a product of foreign interference, are so strong that they are actually able to successfully get the government to withdraw the bill. So this is from more recently, CNN, Georgia withdraws foreign influence bill that sparked angry protests. Now, I see a lot of people already comparing this to the 2014 US-sponsored protests in Ukraine. And that was very openly a US-engineered unrest. We had acting high-level representatives of the US State Department in the streets of Kiev during the protests, or providing material support to the protesters. We had US senators on stage with actual Nazi political parties on stage voicing support in Kiev for these protests. And just imagine if it was the other way around, a Russian or Chinese parliament member or party member on stage in the United States backing violent protests, trying to oust the US government and rewrite the US Constitution. It would be an utter absurdity. And yet this is what the US openly did in Ukraine in 2014, but they also did it before that. So this is actually a reoccurring theme. This is history repeating itself several times. I've showed this article before. It's worth repeating. This is from 2004. So 10 years before the 2014 overthrow of the elected government of Ukraine. This is from The Guardian. US campaign behind the turmoil in Kiev. The American campaign is an American creation, a sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing that in 4 countries in 4 years has been used to try to salvage rigged elections and topple unsavory regimes. So they're making excuses for this, but what they're obviously describing is US meddling in another nation's internal political affairs, and more specifically, meddling in their elections. It goes on and it says, funded and organized by the US government, deploying US consultancies, pollsters, diplomats, and 2 big American parties and US non-government organizations. The campaign was first used in Europe in Belgrade in 2000 to beat Slobodan Milosevic at the ballot box. Richard Miles, the US ambassador in Belgrade, played a key role. And by last year, 2003, because this was written in 2004, as US ambassador in Tbilisi, Georgia, he repeated the trick, coaching Mikhail Saakashvili in how to bring down his opponent. So they're admitting that when the opposition took power in Georgia in 2003, led by Mikhail Saakashvili, that was owed to US interference. They interfered in the internal political affairs of Georgia, and they installed a client regime into power, just as they did in Ukraine in 2014. And then we remember from 2003 onward, the US began pouring weapons into Georgia. They began training the Georgian military. And by 2008, Georgia attacked Russia. They did. They attacked Russia. And you will hear people in the US government and in the Western media claim that Russia invaded Georgia in 2008. But no, according to Reuters and actually, according to the European Union, Georgia started the war with Russia, EU-backed report. This is from 2009, a year after Georgia triggered this conflict with Russia. And it says an independent report blamed Georgia for starting last year's 5-day war with Russia. It's a very short war, very destructive. And, well, they will point out how badly it went for Georgia, this game of playing proxy to the US. The findings were particularly critical of US ally Georgia's conduct under President Mikhail Saakashvili and are likely to further damage his political standing. They could also deepen Western concerns about his leadership and the stability of the former Soviet republic, which have set back its hopes of joining NATO and the EU and shaking confidence in oil and gas routes running through the South Caucasus. In the mission's view, it was Georgia which triggered off the war when it attacked Taskent in South Ossetia with heavy artillery on the nights of the 7th and 8th of August 2008. And this was a Swiss diplomat who led the investigation. That is what he said. And of course, Mikhail Saakashvili is the politician that The Guardian in their 2004 article admit the US installed into power the previous year, 2003. So you can see what the United States has already done to Georgia by meddling in its internal political affairs, putting client regimes into power, and then destroying the country, putting it on a path to self-destruction solely in Washington's pursuit of its own foreign policy objectives, done entirely at the cost of Georgia. And we can see the same thing playing out with Ukraine. The US is doing the same exact thing to Ukraine. They overthrew the elected government, they put a client regime into power, and they have steered it off a cliff ever since, destroying its economy, pitting it in a war first against its own people and then against the Russian Federation. Now we see this situation brewing in Georgia, and the government is backing off of this bill. Maybe this will smooth things over, maybe it won't. But what the United States is obviously trying to do with this opposition that they have created, that they are backing, that they are encouraging to take to the streets and carry out violence, this is to create another crisis along Russia's periphery. And if you think that that is just me imagining that, I will actually cite signed and dated US policy papers that admit that this is exactly what the plan is. So this is from 2019. Extending Russia, competing from advantageous ground. The links to all of these will be in the video description below. It includes measures like provide lethal aid to Ukraine. This was meant to extend Russia politically, militarily, economically. Then they also have another measure. It's called exploit tensions in the South Caucasus. Well, Georgia's in the South Caucasus, isn't it? So what does it say? It says the United States could push for a closer NATO relationship with Georgia and Azerbaijan, likely leading Russia to strengthen its military presence in South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Armenia, and southern Russia. And they would have to do this if NATO and the US was expanding up to Russia's southern border. Russia would have to bolster defenses there. And that would divert resources away from where now? It would divert them away from Ukraine. The RAND Corporation paper continues. It says Georgia has long sought NATO membership. It joined the North Atlantic Cooperation Council in 1992, shortly after becoming independent, and joined the Partnership for Peace program in 1994. In theory, the Allies put Georgia on a path to membership, but the 2008 Russo-Georgia War put this effort on indefinite hold. Georgia, however, has never given up on its NATO ambitions, participating in NATO operations in the Mediterranean, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. To Georgia's advantage? I don't think so. If European opposition prevents Georgia's ascension into the alliance, the United States could establish bilateral security ties. So again, doing this solely to provoke Russia and to draw Russia's attention and ire toward Georgia, which the US will not protect because the US does not care about Georgia. All they care about is extending, as the RAND Corporation's paper is titled, extending Russia. Again, there's zero benefit for Georgia to go down this path again, because they've already gone down this path. US installed client regime, a proxy war with Russia. They lost. They paid dearly for it. And even the RAND Corporation paper says how disastrous this was when Georgia was used as a US proxy in 2008. It says, in August 2008, after peace agreements with separatists broke down, Georgia fought a brief war over the South Ossetia and Abkhazia enclaves, two semi-independent pro-Russian provinces of Georgia. So even this Rand Corporation paper admits that it was Georgia fighting the war. They don't say it directly, but between this, the way they word this, and the EU report investigation and subsequent report, it was clearly Georgia that provoked the conflict. The war proved disastrous for Georgia. Russia quickly intervened and eventually occupied both regions and briefly other parts of Georgia as well. Georgia signed a ceasefire agreement on August 14, 2008, only 8 days after the Russian intervention. However, Russian forces remain in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, both of which have since declared their independence. So Georgia just compounded all of their problems by playing proxy for the US, just as Ukraine is doing right now. From 2014 to present day, this proxy war they're fighting, that they will not win, and that is demonstrably, visibly destroying the entire country every single day that it goes on. So we can see what this is in Georgia, what is actually going on versus whatever the BBC is trying to claim is going on. This is not the people of Georgia fighting for their, a bright future with the EU. This is yet another country being used as a proxy against Russia by the United States and setting it on a path where it will help advance U.S. geopolitical interests, but entirely at the cost of Georgia, its short and long-term interests, and possibly even its existence. I just want to point out that the United States government has openly condemned the bill that Georgia proposed, and they threatened sanctions against the Georgian government because Georgia doesn't get to protect its sovereignty like any other normal nation. The US says no, they can't, so they cannot. And the threat is sanctions and, of course, physical violence carried out by their proxies in the streets. And the exact same scenario played out here in Thailand. There was a draft NGO law that was proposed to rein in the huge number of US government-funded opposition groups running around in the streets here in Thailand. Because it is such a rampant problem, the US just organized them all together, put them out in the streets, and basically threatened the Thai government that if they try to pass this, there will be chaos in the streets. And so the government, just as Georgia has, withdrew it. And maybe this is a play for time. Maybe these bills can be reintroduced, but it just goes to show you how extensive U.S. interference is in any one of these countries, where they are not even able to put in basic laws to protect their sovereignty because these opposition groups created by the U.S. are already so powerful, so strong, and are useful as leverage for Washington to prevent these nations from just protecting themselves in ways the U.S. can and regularly does. This is the so-called rules-based international order the U.S. wants for the world. It is a one-way street, and what they say goes, and everything else is squashed. So we'll have to keep an eye on the situation in Georgia. Hopefully things will calm down. The government will be very careful not to allow Georgia to follow Ukraine over the cliff. But again, we'll have to wait and see. The U.S. is obviously desperate to open a second front against Russia somewhere, anywhere, possibly in multiple different places. Russia and their allies and partners are going to do everything they can to avoid that. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. Also in the video description below are all of the links to everything that I referenced, as well as ways you can help support my work. I don't monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad ever pops up, please feel free to skip it. It's not helping me out at all in any way. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's one-time donations, month-to-month donations, or even if you're just helping share this work with others, I greatly appreciate that. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you again. And as always, thank you for watching.